You wake up in the year 1340. It is pitch black. There is no refrigerator humming. There is no grocery store down the street. You walk to the central hearth where the fire smolders. The room is thick with smoke. Your breakfast is waiting. It is a rock-hard piece of black bread and a wooden cup of ale. You are 12 years old and you are drinking beer at 6 in the morning. Everything you think you know about what your ancestors ate is wrong. They did not eat giant turkey legs. They did not eat potatoes. They had never seen a tomato. The truth about what went into a human stomach back then is far stranger, much darker, and sometimes significantly more disgusting than you could ever imagine. If you sat down for dinner with an ancient human before 1492, you would face a table missing almost everything you consider basic food. There were no potatoes, there were no tomatoes, there was no corn, no chili peppers, no vanilla, no peanuts, and absolutely no chocolate. These plants evolved in the Americas. Imagine an Italian ancestor who had never seen marinara sauce, or an Irish ancestor who had never seen a potato. For sweetness, they did not have bags of refined white sugar. Honey was the primary sweetener, and it was prohibitively expensive. Cane sugar existed, but it had to be imported from the East at an astronomical cost. It was treated as a medicine, not a food. You would buy sugar at an apothecary in tiny, precious pinches, not at a grocery store. But they were not entirely without culinary innovation. The oldest surviving English cookbook, compiled by the master cooks of King Richard II around the year 1390, contains the first recorded recipe for macaroni and cheese. It was called make-arounds, and it involved thin sheets of dough cut into pieces, boiled, and layered with melted cheese and butter. It looked nothing like the powdered orange stuff today, but the ancestral human desire for carbs and melted dairy is apparently eternal. Speaking of carbs, bread was not just a side dish. Bread was the absolute, non-negotiable foundation of human existence. The average person consumed roughly 1 to 1.5 kilograms of bread every single day. But bread was also a rigid system of social control. The kind of bread you ate immediately announced your class. The nobility ate manchette, a soft, highly refined white bread. It was light, fluffy, and completely out of reach for anyone who actually worked for a living. If you were a peasant, you ate dark, heavy, dense bread made from rye, barley, or oats. In times of poor harvest, you would mix in ground beans, peas, or chestnuts just to make the flour stretch further. If you were at the very bottom of the social ladder, you ate horse bread, a mixture of beans, bran, and sometimes literally sawdust, baked into a hard puck to keep you from starving to death. Bread was also your plate. Instead of ceramic dishes, people used trenchers. A trencher was a thick slice of stale, hard, several days old bread. You would put your roasted meat or thick stew directly on top of the trencher. The hard bread acted as a bowl, soaking up all the juices and fat. When you were done eating, you did not wash your plate. You ate your plate. Eating that dark peasant bread came with a terrifying risk. Rye was highly susceptible to a fungus called ergot. When people unknowingly baked ergot-infected rye into their daily bread, the results were catastrophic. The fungus produces toxic alkaloids closely related to LSD. Entire villages would suddenly descend into mass poisoning. People would experience intense, vivid hallucinations. They would suffer from severe muscle spasms and convulsions. But the most horrifying symptom was severe vasoconstriction. The blood vessels in their extremities would clamp shut, cutting off blood flow to their hands and feet. The victims felt an agonizing, intense, burning sensation, as if their limbs were literally on fire. Eventually, the dead tissue would become gangrenous, turn black, and physically break off from their bodies. They called it St. Anthony's Fire. Nobody understood what caused it. They thought it was a curse, demonic possession, or a punishment from God. Some historians even suspect that outbreaks of ergotism might have triggered the mass hysteria of the Salem witch trials centuries later. Your daily bread could literally drive you insane and make your limbs fall off. When you look past the bread, you have to forget the cinematic image of ancient humans tearing into massive roasted legs of meat. The daily reality for 90% of the population was pottage. Pottage was essentially a thick, slow-cooked porridge or stew. It hung in an iron cauldron over the central fire of the house, simmering all day long. The recipe was incredibly simple and entirely dependent on whatever you could scavenge. You started with oats or barley, threw in peas or beans, and added whatever vegetables you could pull from the ground. Onions, garlic, leeks, cabbage, and turnips were the staples. If you were lucky, you might have a small chunk of salted pork or a cracked animal bone to throw in for flavor. In many households and taverns, this pot never actually emptied. It was a perpetual stew. They just kept the fire going and added new ingredients to whatever was left over from the day before. A single pot of stew could theoretically cook continuously for days, weeks, or even months. Every bowl you ate contained the culinary ghosts of meals past. It sounds bleak, but modern nutritional analysis reveals this peasant diet, packed with whole grains and fibrous vegetables, was actually incredibly healthy, providing highly effective fuel for a grueling life of manual labor. But what about meat? There is a persistent myth that the lower classes were entirely vegetarian, forced to eat only cabbage and dirt. That is not true. They ate meat, just not the kind or the amount you might think. The most common animal on the peasant menu was the pig. Pigs were cheap, they bred quickly, and they could be turned loose in the forest to forage for acorns and garbage. They were the ultimate ancient recycling machines, turning waste into bacon. But this was not the crispy, thinly sliced bacon of a modern breakfast. Without refrigeration, all meat had to be heavily preserved. It was salted until it was practically a mineral, or smoked until it was as tough as leather. Beef was surprisingly rare. Cows were far too valuable to simply kill and eat. A cow was a tractor. It pulled plows, it carried loads, and it produced milk. Killing a healthy cow for a steak would be like setting your car on fire because you needed a reading light. The real tension around meat came from the forest. The woods surrounding a village were often teeming with deer, wild boars, and rabbits. The rivers were full of fish, but the peasants living inches away from this abundance were strictly forbidden from touching any of it. Under forest law, all the prime game belonged exclusively to the local lord or the king. Poaching a deer was not just theft, it was an assault on the social hierarchy. If an ancient human was caught hunting a deer to feed their starving family, the punishments were draconian. You could have your hand chopped off. You could be blinded. You could be hanged from the nearest tree. You could literally starve to death while staring at a forest full of food, simply because the law dictated that certain animals were meant only for noble blood. This control extended into something called sumptuary laws. The government legally dictated what you were allowed to eat based on your social class. Swans, peacocks, and cranes were legally reserved for the elite. Exotic spices were forbidden to commoners, not just because they were expensive, but because the law demanded visual and culinary separation between the rich and the poor. Eating above your station was a literal crime. You also have to understand how they hydrated, which brings us to one of the most stubborn myths in history. We are constantly told that ancient humans drank beer all day because the water was dangerously polluted and would kill them. This is wildly exaggerated. Ancient people were not stupid. They knew what clean water was. Villages and towns were intentionally built near fresh springs, streams, and deep wells. They drank water regularly when they knew the source was safe. But they still drank an astonishing amount of ale. Why? Because ale was not just a drink, it was liquid food. Ale was brewed from malted grains, and it was packed with calories, carbohydrates, and essential B vitamins from the yeast. A peasant working in a field from dawn until dusk needed massive amounts of energy, and thick, unfiltered ale provided that fuel safely. The average manual laborer might consume anywhere from 2 to 5 liters of ale every single day. Records show that highly skilled laborers like stonemasons sometimes received up to 15 pints of ale a day as part of their wages. But they were not stumbling around drunk all the time. Most of what they drank was called small beer. It was a very weak secondary brew with an alcohol content hovering around 1 or 2%. It was just strong enough to kill off harmful bacteria during the boiling process, but weak enough that you could drink it all day without losing your mind. And the people making all this ale were overwhelmingly women, running thriving local businesses out of their kitchens. This entire culinary world was heavily micromanaged by a single, omnipresent authority: the church. Religion did not just dictate your soul, it dictated your stomach. The Catholic calendar was a rigorous cycle of feasting and fasting. For anywhere from a third to half of the entire year, the population was forbidden from eating meat. This included the 40 days of Lent, every single Friday, and numerous holy days. Fasting did not necessarily mean starving, but it meant strict abstinence from the meat of any land animal, and often a total ban on animal fats, milk, cheese, and eggs. But human beings are incredibly clever when they are hungry and restricted. Because the church ruled that fish and water-dwelling creatures were exempt from the meat ban, the definition of fish became highly flexible. The tails of beavers are covered in scales, and they spend most of their time in the water. So, theologians conveniently classified beaver tails as fish. Puffins and certain water birds were also categorized as fish, allowing people to eat them on fasting days. Because cow's milk was banned during Lent, ancient cooks leaned heavily on almond milk. Almond milk is not a modern trend invented by health influencers. It is a 700-year-old staple that ancient cooks used by the gallon to make everything from soups to desserts when dairy was outlawed. The demand for actual fish during these endless fasting days created a massive continental economy. Salted herring became the protein that kept Europe alive. If you were wealthy, however, you could simply buy your way out of the rules. The church sold dispensations, pieces of paper, that legally allowed you to eat butter and dairy during Lent. If there is one thing that defines the extreme wealth of this era, it is spices. Specifically, black pepper. Pepper was so incredibly valuable that it functioned as a literal currency. You could pay your rent with pepper. You could pay your taxes with pepper. You could settle legal debts with pepper. The spices had to travel along an impossibly long and dangerous supply chain. They originated in India and Indonesia, passing through the hands of Arab, Turkish, and Venetian merchants. Every time the spices changed hands, the price doubled. By the time a sack of pepper or cinnamon reached a noble household in England, its value was astronomical. To keep the prices artificially high, the merchants who controlled the trade routes invented elaborate, terrifying lies. They told European buyers that cinnamon grew in deep valleys guarded by giant, deadly snakes. They claimed other spices were kept on sheer cliffs, protected by massive birds of prey. Nobody in Europe could prove them wrong, so they paid the premium. There is a deeply entrenched myth that ancient people used heavy spices to cover up the taste of rotting, spoiled meat. This is completely illogical. If you were rich enough to afford spices that were literally worth more than their weight in gold, you were absolutely rich enough to demand freshly slaughtered meat. Spices were not a chemical cover-up, they were a flex. Dumping a handful of expensive saffron onto a dish was the ancient equivalent of wearing a luxury watch. When those wealthy nobles actually threw a banquet, the goal was not simply to feed people. A banquet was intense, high-stakes political theater. Every course was designed to shock, awe, and intimidate the guests. The cooks created dishes that sound like fever dreams. They would take a peacock, carefully skin it, roast the meat, and then painstakingly sew the cooked meat back inside the original skin and feathers. The bird would be brought to the table looking as though it were still alive, fully plumed and staring at the guests. They served roasted swans, a bird legally reserved exclusively for the crown. They baked massive pies with live birds trapped inside, so that when the crust was cut open, a flock of birds would burst out over the dining table. This is where the old nursery rhyme about 4 and 20 blackbirds baked in a pie actually comes from. It was a real, highly specialized culinary trick. They also specialized in illusion food. Master cooks would take ground meat and mold it to look exactly like a piece of fruit. They would take fish and sculpt it to look like a piece of venison. They created fake eggs by blowing out real eggshells, filling them with brightly colored almond milk and jelly, and serving them as a bizarre magic trick. Between courses, they presented subtleties, which were massive, intricate sculptures made entirely of sugar paste and marzipan. These sculptures depicted castles, mythical beasts, or religious scenes, and they were packed with hidden political messages. Eating the food was secondary. Surviving the political maneuvering of the meal was the real objective. But if you were a commoner walking the loud, filthy streets of a major city like London or Paris, you experienced a completely different kind of culinary innovation. You experienced the birth of fast food. Many urban workers and students lived in cramped, wooden rooms that did not have a kitchen. Cooking inside a tightly packed wooden tenement was a massive fire hazard, and in many places, it was strictly illegal. So, these people relied on cookshops and street vendors. The absolute king of ancient street food was the meat pie. The thick, rock-hard pastry crust of the pie, the coffin, was essentially ancient Tupperware. It kept the meat filling hot, it protected it from the dirt of the street, and it allowed you to eat a hot meal with one hand while walking. You could buy a hot pie, roast goose, or skewered fish directly from a vendor shouting over the noise of the market. But this convenience came with severe risks. Without strict oversight, the street food industry was notorious for horrific food fraud. Dishonest pie sellers were frequently caught mixing the meat of cats, dogs, or diseased rats into their pies and selling them as rabbit or beef. They would use tainted, rotting meat that they bought for pennies and disguise it inside a heavily seasoned crust. They would mix sand and sawdust into bread dough to make it heavier. The situation became so dangerous that cities were forced to create the very first food safety regulations. If a vendor was caught selling rotten meat, the punishment was brutal. They would be forced to wear their rotting meat tied around their neck while the public threw garbage at them. All of this food, whether it was a noble swan or a peasant pie, was fighting a constant, desperate war against time. Without refrigeration, decay was the enemy that never slept. Preservation was not a hobby, it was a matter of life and death. The primary weapon in this war was salt. Salt draws the moisture out of flesh, creating an environment where bacteria simply cannot survive. They salted everything. Meat, fish, and vegetables were packed in literal mountains of salt. Sometimes the meat was so heavily salted that it had to be soaked in fresh water for an entire day just to make it physically edible. Smoking was another vital tool. Hanging meat above a smoky fire coated it in natural antimicrobial compounds and dried it out. In northern climates, they relied on wind and freezing air. They produced something called stockfish, which was cod that had been gutted and hung on wooden racks in the freezing coastal winds until it dried into a substance as hard as a wooden board. Stockfish could remain edible for years. It was so tough that before you could cook it, you had to physically beat it with a heavy wooden mallet to shatter the muscle fibers, and then soak it in water for days. The calendar was built around preservation, a frantic effort to outrun the inevitable rot of winter. But sometimes, all the preservation in the world could not save them. When the weather turned against them, the fragile food system collapsed instantly, bringing an apocalyptic level of suffering. The most horrifying example is the Great Famine of 1315. It started raining in the spring, and it simply did not stop. The torrential, relentless rain drowned the crops in the fields. The harvest failed entirely. Without grain, there was no bread. Without bread, the population immediately began to starve. The desperation that followed is almost impossible to comprehend. People ate their dogs, they ate their cats, they slaughtered their valuable draft horses. When the animals were gone, they went into the woods and dug frantically for roots, boiled grass, and ate acorns. When the plants failed, they boiled leather shoes and harness straps just to have something in their stomachs. And then it got worse. Historical chronicles from the period contain chilling, undeniable reports of cannibalism. The starvation was so absolute, so mind-breaking, that starving mobs raided cemeteries to dig up newly buried corpses. There are records of parents eating their own children to survive. It is a level of trauma so profound that historians believe it permanently scarred the cultural psyche of Europe. The story of Hansel and Gretel, where a desperate family abandons their children in the woods and a witch tries to eat them, is not just a spooky fairy tale. It is a direct cultural echo of the horrors of the Great Famine. And then, just 30 years later, the survivors were hit by the Black Death. The plague wiped out anywhere from 30 to 60% of the entire European population. But here's the twisted, deeply uncomfortable paradox of human history. For the people who actually survived the plague, the culinary world improved dramatically. It was a massive, involuntary reset of the economy. Because there were suddenly so few people left alive, there was an abundance of land and food for the survivors. Labor was suddenly extremely scarce, which meant the surviving peasants could demand much higher wages. The massive fields that once required hundreds of peasants to grow cheap grain were converted into pastures for sheep and cattle because grazing animals required fewer workers. As a result, the diet of the average survivor experienced a massive upgrade. Bioarchaeological analysis of skeletons from the post-plague era shows a dramatic increase in the consumption of animal protein. Peasants who previously survived on watery pottage were suddenly eating thick cuts of beef, fresh fish, better cheese, and drinking stronger ale. For the laboring class, the decades following the apocalypse were ironically a golden age of eating. The nobility panicked. They watched in horror as the lower classes began dressing better and eating high-quality meat. In response, they furiously passed new, even stricter sumptuary laws, desperately trying to force the peasants back to their cheap bread. The physical act of cooking all this food was a daily, deadly hazard. The ancient kitchen was one of the most dangerous places on Earth. Cooking over an open, roaring hearth with long, flowing woolen clothes and heavy, unmanageable pots of boiling oil and water resulted in horrific burns and fatal accidents. The kitchen was so dangerous and prone to catching fire that wealthy households eventually moved the kitchen out of the main house entirely. Inside these kitchens, there were no thermometers and no timers. A cook judged the heat of an oven by sticking their bare hand inside. They timed the cooking of a dish not by minutes, but by reciting prayers. A recipe might instruct a cook to boil an egg for the time it takes to say 3 Lord's prayers. And in the wealthiest kitchens, they relied on a piece of technology that has since been completely erased from history. To turn the massive, heavy spits of roasting meat continuously for hours, they bred a very specific short-legged dog. It was called a turnspit dog. They placed the dog inside a wooden wheel attached to the wall, suspended above the heat of the fire. The dog would run in the wheel like a giant hamster, turning the meat evenly. The turnspit dog is now completely extinct, a living tool used up and discarded by culinary progress. You might think that everything you have just heard is entirely disconnected from your life today. But the food on your plate right now is the direct result of the blood, the laws, and the suffering of the ancient world. The guilds formed to punish the people selling rotten meat pies are the direct ancestors of modern health inspectors. The frantic need to preserve food with salt and smoke built the foundation for the entire modern processed food industry. The obsessive, desperate pursuit of black pepper and cinnamon launched the ships that mapped the globe, colonized continents, and created the global trade network that currently stocks your local grocery store. Almond milk is not a new invention. Food has never just been about calories. In the ancient world, food was a weapon of social control. It was a declaration of political power. It was the driving force of religion. It was the absolute razor-thin boundary between survival and a horrific, agonizing death. And the disturbing truth is, at a fundamental biological level, it still is. Whoever controls the food controls the world. That was true when you were eating rock-hard black bread by a smoky fire in the year 1340, and it is exactly as true today. That's all for today. Anyway, please donate or subscribe to fund the next video.